The rope bit into the skin of her wrists, not with a sharp pain anymore, but with a dull, constant ache that had become part of her. It was a cousin to the ache in her back and the emptiness in her belly. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the dust of the town square, a place that wasn't a square at all, but just a wider part of a dirt road between a dry goods store and a livery that smelled of sweat and old hay. She kept her eyes on the worn tips of her own bare feet, watching the dust puff up around her toes with every nervous twitch of the crowd. They were a low murmur, a collection of curious, pitying, and scornful eyes. She didn't have to look up to feel them. They were a weight pressing down as much as the heat. She had been tied to this hitching post since morning, a piece of living driftwood washed up at the edge of their lives. Her dress, a thin and faded calico, was torn at the shoulder, clinging to her like wet paper in the dry heat. She had learned long ago that silence was a shield, a thin one, but the only one she had. So she stood, a statue of resignation, and waited for the ordeal to take its next turn. A man named Brand strode into the center of the clearing. He was a man polished by his own self-importance, from his silver-buttoned vest to the confident boom of his voice. He owned the stagecoach line, and he had owned her contract of indenture. He had worked her until she was thin as a fence rail, and then, when his wife took a dislike to her quiet presence, he had decided to recoup his investment. "All right, folks," Brand's voice sliced through the haze. A strong back and a quiet mouth. Healthy for the most part. Just needs a firm hand. He gestured to her as if she were a mule, and a ripple of coarse laughter went through the men gathered nearest. She flinched, a small, bird-like movement, but her gaze remained fixed on the ground. She was an object, a problem to be solved, a few dollars to be made. The humiliation was a taste in her mouth, metallic and old. The bidding started, if it could be called that. It was low, insulting. A few coins for a season's mending. $1 for a month of scrubbing floors. Each offer was a fresh stone laid on her chest. The sun climbed higher. The crowd grew bored, their interest waning like a dying fire. They began to drift away, back to their own lives, leaving her in a shrinking circle of gawkers and hard-faced men. It looked as if no one would even pay the pittance Brand was asking. She might be left tied to the post, another piece of refuse for the town to ignore. A cold dread, far worse than the heat, began to seep into her bones. Then, a shadow fell over her. It wasn't Brand's stout outline, but something taller, leaner. The murmuring of the remaining men faltered. She risked a glance from beneath her lashes. He stood at the edge of the small group, half hidden by the livery's long shadow. He was a man made of dust and distance. His hat was low, his coat long and weathered, the color of the parched earth. He wasn't looking at her the way the others had, with appraisal or contempt. He was just looking, his gaze steady and unreadable. He carried whole winters in his eyes, a stillness that seemed to absorb the noise around him. He looked tired, not just from a long ride, but from a long life. Brand, annoyed by the interruption, turned. "Something you need, Silas?" His voice was edged with disdain. "Come to look? She ain't for looking. She's for buying." The man, Silas, didn't answer right away. He just pushed back his hat a fraction, revealing a face carved by sun and sorrow. The lines around his eyes were deep, like dry riverbeds. He looked from Brand to the woman tied to the post, his expression unchanging. The silence stretched out, becoming heavier than the heat. The few remaining townsfolk shifted, sensing a change in the air. Finally, Silas spoke. His voice was low, and it sounded like it came from under floorboards, rough and unused. "I'll take her." It wasn't a bid. It was a statement. Brand scoffed, a short, ugly sound. "With what? You haven't got 2 cents to rub together, Silas. Everyone knows it." Silas reached into the pocket of his worn coat. His movements were slow, deliberate. He pulled out a small leather pouch. It didn't jingle. He loosened the drawstring and poured a handful of coins into his palm. They weren't silver dollars or shiny dimes. They were gold pieces, dull and heavy. Not many, but more than enough. The sight of them silenced Brand instantly. The man's greedy eyes fixed on the gold, his jaw slackening. "That settles my debt with you," Silas said, his voice flat. He tossed the coins onto a nearby barrel. They landed with a solid, definitive clink. "And buys her passage." He didn't wait for Brand's reply. He walked past the stunned man, directly to her. She shrank back against the post as he approached, a lifetime of caution screaming at her. He stopped a few feet away, pulling a small, worn pocket knife from his belt. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and, with two swift, clean motions, sawed through the ropes binding her wrists. The fibers parted. Her hands fell to her sides, numb and tingling. The blood returning was a sharp, stinging pain. She rubbed her wrists, the raw, red welts a stark map of her captivity. She kept her head bowed, expecting a hand on her arm, a harsh command. But it didn't come. He just stood there, waiting. He had claimed her, bought her like a sack of flour, but he made no move to touch her. He just folded his knife and slid it back into his pocket. "Come on," he said, his voice still low and rough. He turned and started walking away from the center of town, not looking back to see if she was following. For a moment, she remained frozen. The dust settled where the crowd had been. The sun beat down. Behind her was the life she knew, the humiliation, the servitude. Ahead was a man who looked like he was carved from the harsh land itself. A man who had paid in gold for a creature nobody else wanted. Taking a shaky breath, she took the first step. Then another. Her bare feet followed his dusty boot prints, leaving the post behind her like a shed skin. The journey was a long stretch of silence. They walked out of the small, blustering town and into the vast, open country that surrounded it. The land was stark and beautiful in its own hard way, a sweep of ochre and brown under a pale, endless sky. The wind was a constant presence, lifting the fine red dust from the trail behind them like the ghosts of their footsteps. Silas walked a few paces ahead of her, his stride long and even. He did not speak, nor did he look back. He moved with a purpose that felt ancient, as if he were simply a part of the landscape's slow, unyielding rhythm. She followed, her own steps tentative at first, then falling into a resigned pattern. The silence was not empty. It was full of the scuff of their boots, the whisper of the wind through dry grasses, and the vast, humming quiet of the plains. After an hour, the sun was at its fiercest. The back of her neck burned, and her throat felt as dry as the dirt beneath her feet. Silas stopped. He unslung a canteen from his shoulder. He didn't turn around, just held it back for her. She hesitated for a second before stepping forward and taking it. His fingers brushed against hers for a fleeting instant, his skin calloused and dry. The water was warm, but it was the most precious thing she had ever tasted. She drank slowly, carefully, then handed it back. He took it without a word, secured it, and started walking again. It was the first kindness, a small, unspoken thing, but it landed in her hollow chest like a smooth stone. They walked for what felt like the rest of the day. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of blood orange and bruised purple. Finally, she saw it. A small cabin, nestled in a slight depression in the land, almost invisible until you were upon it. It was made of weathered, silvered wood, with a stone chimney and a simple porch. It looked less like it was built on the land and more like it had grown out of it. It was stark, honest, and profoundly alone. To the side of the cabin, under a lone, twisted cottonwood, was a small, fenced-off plot of earth. A single, simple wooden cross stood at its head. The sight of it made the ache in her chest sharpen. This was a place of loss. It explained the winters in his eyes. He led her not to the front door, but around to a water pump near the back. He worked the handle until a stream of cold, clear water gushed out. He gestured for her to wash. She knelt and splashed the water on her face, her arms, her dusty feet. It was a baptism of sorts, washing away the grime and sweat of the town. When she was done, he handed her a piece of rough, clean cloth to dry herself. Inside, the cabin was one room, spare and clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. There was a sturdy table with 2 chairs, a bed in one corner, and shelves holding a few tin plates and a small stack of books. Everything had its place. It was the home of a man who lived with precision and without excess. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and pine. He gestured toward a small alcove near the hearth. A simple cot was there, with a neatly folded wool blanket on top. "That's yours," he said. It was the first full sentence he had directed at her since the town. He then moved to the fireplace, laying wood and kindling with an economy of motion. He didn't look at her, giving her space to take in her new surroundings. She stood by the door, a stranger in this quiet, solitary world, not knowing what the rules were, what was expected. He must have sensed her uncertainty. Without turning from the fire he was building, he spoke again, his voice a low rumble. "You're safe here. I don't lock doors." The words were simple, practical, but to her they were a contract. "You are not a prisoner." He lit the kindling, and a small flame flickered to life, pushing back the encroaching dusk and casting long, dancing shadows across the room. He took a loaf of dark bread and a hunk of cheese from a cupboard, placing them on the table. He cut 2 equal shares. He sat in one chair and looked at the other, a silent invitation. She moved slowly, cautiously, and sat down opposite him. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the quiet chewing of bread. He ate like he did everything else, with a slow, deliberate focus. He didn't watch her, but she felt his awareness of her presence in the room. This was the new shape of her life. A shared table, a warm fire, and a vast, unspoken space between them. When the meal was done, he took the plates to a wash basin, and she retreated to her cot, pulling the coarse blanket up to her chin. The firelight warmed her skin. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she fell asleep without the fear of a lock turning in a door. The days settled into a rhythm, as steady and quiet as a slow heartbeat. Life in the cabin was governed by the sun and the seasons, not by the clock. A language grew between them, one built not of words, but of actions. It was a language of shared labor and respected distance. He would rise before dawn, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards the first sound of the morning. He would be gone for hours, tending to the few cattle he kept, mending fences that stretched out into the vast emptiness, his figure a small, dark shape against the rising sun. She would wake to the quiet house. At first, she did nothing, simply sitting on her cot, a ghost in his home. But the stillness demanded action. She began to sweep the floor, the whisper of the broom a comforting sound. She learned the quirks of the old wood stove, how to coax a steady heat from it. She washed their 2 plates, their 2 cups. She was stitching their lives together with raw thread, creating a tapestry of routine where none had existed. One morning, he came back to find she had taken the torn shirt he'd left on his chair and mended it. The stitches were small and neat, a pale line against the faded blue fabric. He picked it up, running a callous thumb over her work. He said nothing, but that evening, he left a small, polished river stone on the edge of her cot. It was smooth and cool, a perfect gray oval. A silent thank you. She started venturing outside. She found a small patch of earth behind the cabin where the soil was dark and rich. She remembered her mother, long ago, tending a garden. With a rusty trowel she found in the lean-to, she began to turn the soil. He watched her from a distance one afternoon, then left a small pouch of seeds, squash and beans, on the porch rail the next morning. She discovered the grave belonged to a woman named Ilara. The name was carved into the wooden cross, the letters faded by years of sun and snow. Sometimes, when the wind was gentle, she would pull the few stubborn weeds from around the marker. Once, she found a single, hardy purple wildflower growing by the fence line and placed it at the base of the cross. She felt him watch her from the cabin window, his silhouette a motionless shadow. He never acknowledged it, but the space between them felt a little less vast that day. She tried baking bread. The first loaf was a disaster, hard as a rock and twice as dense. She left it on the table, a monument to her failure. When he came in for his meal, he saw it. He picked it up, weighed it in his hand, and a flicker of something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "That loaf died in vain," he said. His voice laced with a dry, rough humor she had never heard before. She felt a flush of embarrassment, but his tone wasn't cruel. "It's a little dry," she admitted, her own voice thin from disuse. "You didn't complain about mine," he countered, gesturing to the store-bought loaves he usually had. It was the closest they had come to a conversation. It felt fragile and new, like the first green shoots in her garden. The thaw was slow, almost imperceptible, like the melting of a frozen river from the bottom up. He began to leave his coat on a hook by the door instead of taking it with him into the far corners of his life. She began to hum, quiet, tuneless melodies, as she worked by the fire. The sound filled the silence, softening its hard edges. The house, which had felt like a hollow vessel of his grief, began to breathe again. One night, a storm rolled in, a violent tantrum of thunder and lightning that shook the small cabin. She woke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound of it, the flashes of light, threw her back into a dark, locked room from her past. A cry escaped her lips before she could stop it. The floorboards creaked. He was standing in the darkness, a few feet from her cot. She could just make out his shape against the faint glow of the dying embers in the hearth. "The storm will pass," he said, his voice a low anchor in the chaos. "Don't lock me in," she whispered, the words tumbling out, raw and terrified. It was a plea torn from a place she kept hidden from the world. He was silent for a long moment. The thunder cracked overhead. "I told you," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I don't lock doors." He moved to the hearth and added a small log to the embers. He didn't light a lamp, just let the soft, orange glow push back the deepest shadows. He sat in his chair, not looking at her, simply being present. He sat there until the storm wore itself out and the only sound was the steady patter of rain on the roof. He sat there until her breathing evened out and she fell back into a fragile sleep. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and sage. When she came to the table for their silent breakfast, she found he had fixed the broken handle on her favorite cup, wrapping it tightly with waxed thread. It was a small thing, quiet thing, but it felt like everything. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not just the sorrow in his eyes, but a deep, abiding kindness that ran like an aquifer beneath the dry, cracked surface of his grief. He met her gaze for a beat longer than usual, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The foundation was laid, a thing of trust, built piece by piece, in the quiet, shared space of his solitary world. The piece they had built was fragile, a thin pane of glass against a hard world. They both knew it, felt it in the way the wind sometimes turned mean, a foreshadowing. The harbinger came not as a letter or a rider in the night, but as a smudge of dust on the far eastern horizon, a place where the prairie met the sky. Silas saw it first. He was on the roof of the small barn, replacing shingles torn loose by the last storm. He went still, a hammer in his hand, his body taut. He watched the dust cloud for a long time as it slowly grew, resolving itself into the shapes of 3 riders. He knew who they were. His face, already etched with a kind of permanent sorrow, seemed to settle into harder lines, like stone preparing for a blow. He climbed down from the roof without haste, his movements economical and grim. He walked to the cabin, his boots making no sound on the soft earth. She was in her garden patch, her back to him, tending the small squash vines that had begun to snake across the ground. The sight of her there, so rooted in this place he had given her, caused a fierce, protective ache to clench deep in his chest. "Go inside," he said. His voice was flat, stripped of all warmth. "Stay there." She turned, her hands smudged with dirt. She saw the look on his face and then followed his gaze to the approaching riders. The fear was instant, a cold shock. She recognized the confident, arrogant way the lead rider sat his horse. Brand. Her breath caught in her throat. The past she had so carefully buried was riding toward them, kicking up dust. She didn't argue. She scurried inside the cabin, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She didn't hide, but stood by the small window, her knuckles white where she gripped the sill, watching. Silas didn't go inside. He didn't fetch his rifle from its pegs over the mantel. He simply walked to the edge of his property, marked by a low, weathered fence, and stood there, his hands loose at his sides. He was waiting. He made his land a fortress, not with walls, but with his own unyielding presence. Brand and his 2 hired men reined in their horses just outside the fence line. The animals were jittery, tossing their heads, sensing the tension. Brand smirked, a cruel, familiar expression. "Silas," he called out, his voice oily with false civility. "Enjoying the hired help? I've come to collect my property. Seems there was a misunderstanding about our transaction." Silas didn't move. "There was no misunderstanding," he said, his voice carrying easily on the quiet air. "I paid your price. The matter is settled." "The matter is far from settled," Brand sneered, leaning forward on his saddle horn. "I was under duress. The town council agrees. A man can't be held to a deal made in bad faith. She's an indentured servant. That's a legal contract. What you have there is stolen goods." "She's not goods," Silas said. The words were quiet, but they had the weight of iron. "She's a person, and she's staying here." One of Brand's men, a lanky man with a mean squint, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "The law says different, widower. The law says she belongs to him." The word widower was meant to be a barb, a reminder of Silas's loss, his isolation. But Silas didn't even flinch. His gaze remained locked on Brand. His stillness was his weapon. It was unnerving, unnatural. It spoke of a man who had already lost everything that could be taken and had nothing left to fear. "Your law doesn't cross this fence," Silas stated simply. Brand's civility finally cracked. His face hardened into a mask of rage. "I've got papers, Silas, signed by the judge. I'm taking her back. Either you hand her over or we'll come in and get her. Don't make this uglier than it has to be." The threat hung in the air, vibrating like a plucked wire. The sun beat down. The wind whispered through the grass. Inside the cabin, the woman watched, her body trembling. This quiet man, this sad, solitary man, was standing between her and the hell she had escaped. The sanctuary he had built with silence and small kindnesses was about to become a battleground. Brand made a motion for his men to dismount. The confrontation was shifting from words to force. As the 2 hired hands swung their legs over their saddles, a change happened. It started in Silas. He didn't raise his voice or his fists. He simply drew himself up to his full height, and it seemed as if the very land rose with him. He was no longer just a man. He was a boundary, a line drawn in the dirt that dared them to cross. "She stays," he repeated. His voice was a low growl of thunder, a promise of violence held in reserve. It was the calm before a storm, more menacing than any shout. Brand hesitated, seeing the shift. He had expected a weary, broken man. He found something else entirely, something ancient and immovable. He gestured for his men to hold. Just then, the cabin door creaked open. She stepped out onto the porch, her face pale but her eyes burning. Brand's gaze snapped to her, a predator's triumphant leer spreading across his face. "There she is. Come on now, girl. No more foolishness." She ignored him. Her eyes were on Silas, on his straight, lonely back. Then her gaze swept past him to the men, and finally, it landed on the woodpile next to the porch. Leaning against it was the small axe they used for splitting kindling. Her movements were fluid, devoid of the hesitation that had defined her for so long. She walked down the single step, across the packed earth, and picked up the axe. She didn't raise it like a weapon. She just held it, its weight familiar in her hand, the smooth wood of the handle a solid reality. She walked to stand not behind Silas, but beside him, just a few feet apart. She faced Brand, the axe held loosely at her side, her chin lifted. She said nothing. Her voice was not needed. The act itself was a shout. I am not property. I am not a prize to be reclaimed. I choose where I stand. The sight of them, standing together, the tall, silent man and the slight woman with the fire in her eyes and an axe in her hand, was a picture of absolute, unified defiance. They were two broken pieces that, side by side, had become whole and unbreakable. Brand's smirk faltered. He looked at Silas, who hadn't so much as glanced at her but whose presence seemed to swell to encompass her. He looked at the woman, and for the first time, he saw not a timid servant, but a person with a will of her own. He saw the fight in her, a reflection of the unyielding strength in the man beside her. His bravado was a hollow thing, built on bullying the weak. Faced with this quiet, solid wall of two people defending their home, it crumbled. The legal papers in his pocket felt like useless scraps. There was a law older than any judge's signature at work here, the law of sanctuary. This isn't over, he snarled. But the threat was empty, a dog barking as it retreated. He wrenched his horse's head around, his movements jerky and angry. You'll regret this, Silas. His men, looking relieved to avoid a confrontation with the ghosts in Silas's eyes, scrambled back onto their horses. They kicked their mounts into a gallop, churning up dust, their departure a frantic, graceless retreat. Silas and the woman stood unmoving, watching until the dust cloud was once again just a smudge on the horizon. The silence that rushed back in was profound. It was filled with the hammering of her heart and the deep, steady rhythm of his breathing. The wind blew, carrying the scent of sage and rain-washed earth. The threat had been met and turned away, not by shouting or gunfire, but by the simple, powerful act of two people standing together on a piece of land they had decided to call home. He finally turned his head and looked at her. His eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw not just sorrow, but pride. She was still holding the axe, her knuckles white. Her grip slowly loosened, and the tool felt heavy, suddenly just a piece of wood and steel again. You didn't have to do that, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Yes, I did, she whispered, and the sound of her own voice, firm and clear, surprised her. A shared look passed between them, an acknowledgement of the line they had crossed together. They were no longer just a man and a woman sharing a roof. They were a fortress. They were a fact. And in the quiet aftermath of the storm they had weathered, the foundation of their new life settled, deep and strong, into the hard prairie soil. In the days that followed, the silence in the cabin changed again. It was no longer a space of caution or grief, but a comfortable blanket they shared. The unspoken contract had been fulfilled and then forged anew in the fire of defiance. They had stood together, and in doing so had solidified a bond stronger than any legal paper or spoken vow. One evening, they sat by the fire, the flames casting a warm, flickering light on the rough-hewn walls. The meal was finished, the plates clean. Outside, the world was a vast darkness, but inside, there was a circle of warmth and light. He had been staring into the flames, lost in thought. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. They never gave you a name, did they? He asked. It wasn't an accusation, just a quiet observation. She looked up from watching the fire, a flicker of the old hurt crossing her face before it was gone. She shook her head. She had been girl, you, a creature defined by her function, never by an identity. Silas was quiet for a long time, turning a small piece of wood over and over in his hands. My mother's name was Lena, he said at last, his gaze still on the fire. It means light. She was a kind woman. He paused, then looked directly at her, his eyes clear and steady in the firelight. I think it would suit you. Lena. The name landed in the quiet room, a soft weight, felt foreign and beautiful. It was a gift, the most profound one she had ever been given. It wasn't just a name, it was a personhood. It was an acknowledgement that she was not just a survivor, but someone who could carry light. Tears pricked her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She just nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "Lena," she repeated, tasting the sound of it on her tongue. Fit. The next day, they worked together to repair the section of fence Brand's horses had trampled. They moved in a comfortable rhythm, he setting the posts, she handing him the rails. Their hands brushed. There was no apology, no flinching away. It was just a part of the work, a part of the new life they were building, rail by rail. As they worked, they saw a wagon approaching from the direction of town. It wasn't Brand. It was one of their neighbors, a gruff farmer named Hewitt, a man who had been in the crowd that first day. He pulled his wagon to a stop. "Heard Brand came calling," Hewitt said, not meeting their eyes, instead looking at the fence. "Heard you sent him packing," he grunted. "Good." He reached into the back of his wagon and pulled out a sack. "Wife made extra bread. Figured you could use it." He set the sack on the ground, tipped his hat awkwardly, and drove off without another word. It was an offering, an apology, an acceptance. The community, once their judge, was slowly becoming their shield. That winter was hard, the snow piling in deep drifts against the cabin. But inside it was warm. The house was filled with the smell of baking bread that was now light and airy, and the quiet sound of Lena humming. Silas began to talk more, telling her stories of his father, who had built the cabin, of the land, and sometimes, in quiet, halting sentences, of Alara. He was emptying the hollow rooms of his grief, and Lena was filling them with her quiet, steady light. One spring morning, she hung a small, framed mirror on the wall, something she'd traded for with Hewitt's wife. It was the first purely decorative thing in the house. It reflected the light from the window, making the single room feel brighter, larger. Silas came in and saw it. He looked at it, then at her, and the ghost of a true smile touched his lips. The house was no longer just a shelter haunted by the past. It was a home, breathing with the promise of a future. The final image of them was not one of high drama or passionate declaration. It was of them sitting on the porch in the evening, as they often did. The sun was setting, casting long, peaceful shadows. His chair was close to hers now. The silence between them was not a void but a shared space of deep and abiding peace. He reached over, his hand covering hers where it rested on the arm of her chair. His touch was warm, solid, a promise of forever. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. Together, they watched the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon, content in the quiet world they had built from the ashes of two broken lives. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath, cradling them in its harsh but beautiful embrace. This story, you see, it ain't just about a man rescuing a woman from a cruel world. It's simpler and maybe a whole lot bigger than that. It's about what happens when two people, hollowed out by their own private griefs, find a way to stand beside each other and face down the emptiness. It's a story about the quiet courage it takes to build a home, not with wood and nails, but with shared silence and small, unspoken kindnesses. It's about the power of a name. Giving someone a name is like giving them back their soul, telling them they are seen, that they matter. And having the courage to accept that name is the first step toward believing it yourself. So here's your naming. It's the moment you decide your past will no longer be the only story told about you. We all have our own harsh landscapes to cross, our own ghosts to quiet. We search for sanctuary, a place to mend what's been broken. But sometimes that sanctuary isn't a place at all. Sometimes, if you're brave enough to be still and quiet enough to listen, you might find it's a person. And in the shelter of their steady presence, you might just find that a fire only changes everything if something new and true is waiting in the ash.